When you grow old, 9 reasons why people secretly hate you. Aging is a remarkable journey, one filled with wisdom, resilience, and stories only time can tell. Yet as the years pass, you may notice a shift in how people treat you. Friends grow distant, younger generations misunderstand you, and in some cases you sense unspoken resentment. But why? You've lived, learned, and earned your place in this world, so what could make others secretly dislike you? The truth is, aging doesn't just bring experience, it changes social dynamics in ways you might not expect. Your presence alone can stir envy, misunderstandings, and even silent competition. The respect you once commanded may seem to fade, replaced by quiet dismissals or passive indifference. But make no mistake, this isn't about your worth, it's about how others perceive their own. In this video, we'll uncover 9 hidden reasons why people might secretly hold negative feelings toward you as you age. Understanding these dynamics isn't about seeking approval, it's about maintaining your peace, wisdom, and dignity in a world that doesn't always recognize their value. Stay with us to discover the truth behind these social shifts and how to rise above them with grace. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because wisdom deserves to be heard. 1. Envy and jealousy. The great Stoic philosopher Seneca once wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, who is poor." Envy is not about what you have, it is about what others feel they lack. In ancient Greece, Themistocles, the brilliant Athenian general, was once envied by his peers for his growing influence. Rather than resenting their hostility, he focused on his own virtues, understanding that jealousy is often the burden of the envious, not the envied. His lesson still holds true today. Your success does not steal from others, it merely reflects what they believe they lack. I remember a time, not so long ago, when I stood on my front porch, watching the world go by. The street I lived on was not the same one I had known in my younger years. The faces were different, the energy had changed. But what remained was the silent undercurrent of envy that has existed since the dawn of time. My neighbor James was a good man. Or at least, he used to be. We had grown up together, fought our own battles against time and hardship, and in the end, we both made something of our lives. But as we aged, something shifted. I could see it in the way his eyes lingered on my home, my family, the small comforts I had worked decades to build. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then came the remarks, small, cutting words hidden in casual conversations. "Must be nice to have your kids visit so often," he said one day, staring at my driveway where my son's car was parked. "Some of us didn't have the luxury of retiring early," he muttered another time, when he saw me tending my garden while he left for work. It was envy, plain and simple. And it stung, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I knew he was measuring his life against mine, as if happiness were a waste to be won. One evening I found him sitting alone on his porch, staring off into the distance. There was something in his face, a tiredness, a quiet sorrow. And in that moment I understood. "James," I said as I sat down beside him, "you ever hear the story of the 2 farmers?" He looked at me, confused but willing to listen. "There were 2 farmers," I began. "One had a vast field, his crops tall and golden. The other had a smaller plot, his harvest not as plentiful. One day, the farmer with the smaller field looked over the fence and saw the bounty his neighbor had. Instead of tending to his own land, he spent his days cursing the sky, blaming the soil, resenting his neighbor. But in the end, his crops did not grow any taller. And his bitterness? It only poisoned his own field." James was silent for a moment before he let out a long sigh. "Guess I've been looking over the fence too much." "We all do, James," I said, patting his shoulder. "But envy doesn't make the grass greener, it just makes us blind to our own blessings." From that day on, I noticed a change in him. He still worked, still struggled with the thoughts that had haunted him, but there was a difference in his tone, in the way he spoke. And as for me, I learned something too. Envy is not something we can always stop, but we can choose whether to let it take root in our hearts. Now, I ask you, have you ever felt the weight of unspoken envy? Have you ever been on either side of the fence? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. 2. Misunderstandings and ineffective communication. Confucius once said, "The man who asks a question is a fool for a minute, but the man who does not ask remains a fool forever." In ancient China, an elderly scholar named Zhang often shared his wisdom with the younger generation. However, his words, meant to guide, were sometimes met with resistance. Instead of lecturing, Zhang learned to ask questions, allowing the young to arrive at their own conclusions. This way, his wisdom was not imposed but discovered. The lesson? Understanding begins not with speaking but with listening. True wisdom is not in having all the answers, but in knowing how to ask. I sat across from my grandson Ethan in a quiet diner on a Sunday afternoon. He was glued to his phone, his fingers dancing over the screen, his attention slipping in and out of our conversation. It wasn't the first time I felt this growing distance, this silent barrier between us. "You young folks are always on those things," I muttered, shaking my head. He sighed, barely looking up. "Grandpa, it's just how we stay connected." I bit my tongue, feeling the tension rise. I wanted to tell him how in my day, conversation was face-to-face, how people looked each other in the eye when they spoke. But I knew if I said it, it would only push him further away. Instead, I took a deep breath and tried something different. "Ethan," I said, softening my tone, "tell me, what is it that makes your phone so important?" For the first time that afternoon he looked up, surprised by the question. "It's not just a phone, Grandpa. It's where I talk to my friends, where I read news, where I find things that inspire me." I nodded slowly. "You know, when I was your age, we had something similar." He raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, what was that?" "The town square," I chuckled. "We'd meet there after work, talk about the news, share stories, laugh, argue, learn from each other. Sounds a lot like what you're doing on that screen, doesn't it?" He smirked, shaking his head. "Guess so, just different times, different tools." I leaned in. "See, that's where I think we get it wrong, Ethan. When I was young, I thought my father was stuck in the past. He'd tell me that real men wrote letters, not made phone calls. And now, here I am, thinking face-to-face is the only way to communicate, while you live in a world where a message travels across the world in seconds." "Maybe I'm no different than my father was." Ethan's expression softened. "You're not wrong, Grandpa, but sometimes I do wish people would put their phones down and just talk. And I wish people would try to understand the world you live in before judging it," I said, smiling. For the first time in a long time, we met in the middle, not in a place where one of us had to be right and the other wrong, but in a space where understanding could grow. I left that diner that day with a lesson. The words we use shape the bridges we build, or the walls we raise. And in the end, wisdom isn't in having the last word, it's in knowing when to listen. Now, tell me, have you ever felt misunderstood by someone from a different generation? Or have you struggled to understand their world? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments below. 3 differences in fundamental values and beliefs. The great philosopher Aristotle once said, "It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it." In ancient Japan, a wise samurai named Masanobu trained under a master who insisted that strict discipline was the key to strength. Yet years later, Masanobu met a younger swordsman who valued fluidity over rigidity, adapting his technique to changing times. At first, Masanobu resisted, believing his master's ways were superior, but over time he realized, wisdom does not lie in clinging to the past, but in knowing when to respect tradition and when to embrace change. I was raised to believe in hard work. My father woke before the sun, spent long hours in the fields, and never complained. He used to tell me, a man's worth is measured by what he builds with his own hands. And I carried that belief with me my entire life. So you can imagine my frustration when my grandson, Michael, told me he was quitting his stable office job to become a content creator. "A what?" I asked, my brows furrowed. "I make videos online, Grandpa. I teach people things, share ideas," he explained, his eyes filled with excitement. I scoffed. "That's not real work, son. Sitting in front of a screen all day? That's not how the world works." Michael sighed, and I could see the disappointment in his face. "Grandpa, the world is different now. People don't just build with their hands. They build with their minds, with technology. Just because something is new doesn't mean it's worthless." But to me, it felt like he was throwing away everything I had worked for. The lessons I had instilled in my children, the values passed down from my father. Work was sweat, effort, tangible, not pixels on a screen. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I was losing him. Maybe, in my stubbornness, I was pushing him away. And so one evening, I swallowed my pride and did something I had never done before. I watched one of his videos. And I'll admit, I didn't understand half of it. But then, I scrolled through the comments. I saw people thanking him for helping them learn, for inspiring them, for giving them hope. I saw the impact he had, not with his hands, but with his words. The next time I saw Michael, I sat beside him and said, "All right, show me what you do." His face lit up, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I wasn't just talking at him, I was listening to him. He showed me how he researched, planned, and created, how his work, though different from mine, still required discipline, effort, and skill. And that's when I realized values don't die, they evolve. My father's lesson wasn't wrong, but neither was Michael's. A man is measured by what he builds, but today he can build in many ways. The foundation remains the same: dedication, passion, purpose. The form? That changes with time. Now, I ask you, have you ever felt like your values clashed with the younger generation? Or perhaps, have you been on the other side, struggling to get an elder to see your perspective? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your experiences. 4. The influence of rumors and gossip. Socrates once spoke of the triple filter test when confronted with gossip. Before listening to a tale, he asked 3 questions. Is it true? Is it good? Is it useful? If the story failed any of these, he dismissed it. In medieval Japan, a wise daimyo was once warned that a rival lord was speaking ill of him. Instead of reacting, he sent the rival a gift, demonstrating that his honor could not be tainted by mere words. The lesson? Gossip only holds power if you let it. Truth and dignity remain untouchable by the whispers of small minds. I learned early in life that a whisper can be more dangerous than a storm. A storm passes, but a whisper, it lingers, weaving itself into people's minds, turning truth into something unrecognizable. It happened to me when I was in my 40s. I had just moved into a new town, eager to start fresh with my wife and kids. I worked hard, kept my head down, and thought I was doing everything right. But one day, I noticed the shift. Conversations stopped when I walked into the room. People who once smiled now offered only tight nods. I didn't understand until a friend, one of the few brave enough to tell me, pulled me aside. "There's talk, Samuel," he said carefully. "They say you left your last town because of financial troubles, that you weren't as honest as you seem." I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't true, not a word of it. I had left my old town simply for a better opportunity. But someone, perhaps jealous, perhaps bored, had spun a different story. I wanted to fight back, to defend myself, to stand in the middle of town and shout the truth for all to hear. But I knew something. Those who believe gossip rarely seek the truth, and those who know you don't need an explanation, so I stayed silent. I let my actions do the talking. I continued working hard, being kind, showing up for my family. And slowly the tide turned. The ones who truly paid attention saw the truth in how I lived my life, not in the lies they had been fed years later. An old woman in town, one who had once believed the gossip, approached me. "I was wrong about you, Samuel," she admitted, her voice quiet with shame. "I listened when I shouldn't have." I smiled, not with bitterness, but with understanding. "It happens to the best of us," I said. "The important thing is that you learned, and that's what I want you to know. Rumors, gossip, half-truths, they are like weeds. If you fight them with more gossip, you only help them spread. But if you stand firm, rooted in your own integrity, they wither in time." Have you ever been the subject of unfair rumors, or have you, like the old woman, realized you believe something false about someone? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. 5. Personal insecurities and projection. The Buddha once said, "Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." In ancient Persia, King Cyrus had a loyal advisor, Darius, whose wisdom made him beloved. Yet one noble, envious of Darius's influence, spread rumors to turn the king against him. When confronted, Darius simply said, "A man's heart is his own burden, whether filled with envy or peace." Instead of retaliating, he remained true to his character, and in time, the king saw the noble's deception. The lesson? People project their insecurities onto others, but integrity will always outlast jealousy. I once had a friend named Richard. We had known each other since our 20s, back when life was a whirlwind of ambition, struggle, and dreams. We built our lives side by side, marriages, careers, children, but as we aged, something changed. At first it was small, a passing comment about how some people have all the luck, when I mentioned my son had bought his first home. A dismissive chuckle when I talked about my morning walks, as if good health were just a fortunate accident. Then it turned sharper. "Must be nice to never have had real struggles," he muttered one day, after I told him how grateful I was for my life. That stung, because I had struggled, more than he knew. He hadn't seen the nights I lay awake wondering if I could pay the mortgage. He hadn't watched me bury my wife after a long illness. He hadn't felt the weight of starting over when everything seemed lost. I realized then that Richard wasn't angry at me, he was angry at his own life. His disappointments, his regrets, his missed chances, they had nothing to do with me, but I had become his mirror, reflecting back everything he didn't want to see. I tried to help. I encouraged him, reminded him of his own blessings, but resentment is a stubborn thing, and eventually I had to make a choice: drown in someone else's bitterness or protect my own peace. So I stepped back, not with anger, not with hatred, but with the quiet understanding that some people will never be happy for you, not because you've done anything wrong, but because they cannot find happiness within themselves. Years later, I heard Richard was still the same, still bitter, still resentful, still blaming others for his unhappiness. And I moved forward. I surrounded myself with people who lifted me up, not those who tried to drag me down. And that's the lesson I want you to take from this. Some people will resent your joy, your success, even your resilience, not because you have wronged them, but because they see in you what they wish they had. You cannot change them, but you can choose who you allow in your life. So tell me, have you ever felt the sting of someone else's resentment? Have you had to walk away for the sake of your own peace? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. 6. Lack of empathy and understanding. Lao Tzu once said, "To the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders." In ancient Rome, an elderly senator named Cato walked with a limp, a reminder of his years of service. Young politicians mocked his slow gait, calling him outdated. One day when they ridiculed him, he simply smiled and said, "You mock my pace, yet you walk on the roads I built." The laughter faded, replaced by silence. The lesson? The young often dismiss the struggles of the old until they face them themselves. Wisdom does not rush, it endures, and respect is a debt all must eventually pay. I was standing in line at the grocery store, my hands gripping the cart for balance. The line wasn't long, but my movements had slowed over the years. My fingers weren't as quick, my knees not as steady. Behind me I heard the sighs. Impatient, restless, growing louder. "Come on!" a young woman muttered under her breath. "Some of us have places to be." I turned, meeting her eyes. She was in her 20s, phone in one hand, frustration in the other. Once I might have scolded her. But life had taught me that understanding is not forced, it is invited. "You're in a hurry," I said gently. She rolled her eyes. "Yeah, I've got work, deadlines, you know how it is." I nodded. "I do. I once rushed through life too, thinking time was endless, that patience was for people who had nothing to do." I smiled. "Funny thing about time, it has a way of making you slow down whether you want to or not." She frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Tell me something," I continued. "Do you remember the first time you saw your parents struggle with something simple? Maybe your dad needing glasses or your mom forgetting where she put her keys?" Her face softened. "Yeah, I guess I do. And did it scare you?" I asked. Her lips parted, but she didn't answer right away. "That's what aging is," I told her. It's not just getting old, it's watching the world speed up while you slow down. It's realizing that people stop seeing you the way they used to. That one day someone like you will sigh behind someone like me, thinking we're just in the way." Silence hung between us. Then, almost hesitantly, she said, "I never thought about it like that." I smiled. Most people don't, until it happens to them. When it was finally my turn, she didn't rush past me. Instead, she helped me unload my groceries, and for that small moment the world felt a little more understanding. That's the thing about empathy. It doesn't come naturally to everyone, but it can be awakened. So, I ask you, have you ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or hurried along because of your age? Or have you ever been the one who rushed past someone, not realizing the lesson waiting to be learned? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. 7. Competition or rivalry. Lao Tzu once said, "When you are content to be simply yourself and don't compare or compete, everyone will respect you." In ancient India, two brothers, Ratan and Suraj, were raised by the same teacher. Ratan became a wealthy merchant, while Suraj devoted himself to philosophy. One day, Suraj asked their teacher why Ratan was celebrated more. The teacher replied, "A river does not envy the mountain, nor does the mountain mock the river. Each serves its purpose. If you measure your worth by another's path, you will never be at peace. True success is not in comparison, but in contentment." My brother Thomas and I were born only 2 years apart. Growing up, we were like two sides of the same coin, always competing, always trying to outdo one another. Who could run faster, who could climb higher, who could make our father prouder? But childhood competitions don't end in childhood, they evolve. Thomas became a successful businessman, always dressed in fine suits, always with another investment lined up. Me? I chose a simpler life. I worked hard, raised my kids, and never sought more than what I needed. We lived differently, but we were still family, at least I thought so. Then, at our mother's funeral, I overheard him say, Well, it's easy for him, isn't it? He never had the pressure I did. He never had to prove himself." I clenched my fists, biting back the words that burned on my tongue. Easy? He thought my life had been easy? He didn't see the nights I stayed up worrying about my kids, the sacrifices I made, the dreams I let go of so my family could have stability. He only saw that I smiled more than he did, and that was when I realized this wasn't about me. It was about him. Thomas was still competing, still measuring his success against mine, and maybe, just maybe, he thought I had won. At first I wanted to confront him, to tell him that life wasn't a race, but then I thought back to our childhood, to all the times I had tried to prove myself to him, and all the times he had tried to do the same to me. Neither of us ever truly won, because there was never a prize. So instead, I walked over to him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and simply said, "You've done well, Thomas. You've built a good life." His expression shifted, confusion, maybe even disbelief. "Yeah, well, so have you," he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. That was the closest he had ever come to admitting that maybe I had something he wished he had too. I never engaged in the competition again after that. And you know what? When I stopped competing, so did he. That's the thing about rivalry. It only thrives if you feed it. Some people will always compare. Some will always think that your happiness is a reflection of their failure. But you don't have to play along. You can choose to step away, to celebrate your own journey without proving anything to anyone. So tell me, have you ever felt competition, even when you never asked for it? Have you ever been compared, even when your path was different? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. 8. The influence of social expectations. The Greek philosopher Diogenes was once criticized for living in a barrel and rejecting societal norms. When asked why he didn't conform, he replied, "I am not mad, I am simply free." In ancient China, a scholar named Lao Peng retired at 60 and shocked his village by becoming a musician. When they mocked him, he said, "A tree does not ask permission to bloom again." Years later, those same critics sat in awe at his performances. The lesson? Society may set expectations, but life has no rulebook. The only real regret is living by someone else's script instead of your own. When I turned 70, I bought a motorcycle. You should have seen the looks on my children's faces. My daughter nearly dropped her coffee. My son shook his head as if I'd announced I was moving to Mars. "Dad," he sighed, "you're too old for this." Too old? I had worked all my life, followed every rule, sacrificed for my family, and now that I wanted something for myself, I was too old? "What do you think will happen?" I asked. "That I'll fall off and break a hip?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The message was clear. I was supposed to be careful, predictable, quiet. But I wasn't ready to fade into the background just yet. That first ride was terrifying. My hands trembled as I gripped the handlebars, my heart raced faster than it had in years. But when I finally took off down the road, the wind against my face, something inside me awakened. It wasn't just about the motorcycle. It was about proving to myself that I wasn't done yet. Word spread fast in my small town. "Did you hear? Samuel bought a motorcycle. At his age, what's he trying to prove?" Some people laughed, others whispered. I even overheard an old friend say he should act his age. Act my age? What does that even mean? Should I sit in a rocking chair and wait for life to be over? Should I stop dreaming because someone else decided my time was up? One day a neighbor, an old man like me, stopped me as I was polishing my bike. "I envy you," he admitted. "I always wanted to travel, but my kids told me it was too risky. Now, I sit at home watching life pass me by." I looked him in the eyes and said, "Then go. Go before it's too late." He chuckled. Easier said than done. But a few months later I saw him packing his car. He waved at me with a grin. "Heading to the Grand Canyon, Samuel. First time in my life." That's when I realized something. People don't criticize because they truly think you're wrong. They criticize because your courage reminds them of their own hesitation. So, I ask you, have you ever been told you were too old, too late, too different to do something? And did you listen? Or did you, like me, take that first terrifying step toward living on your own terms? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. 9. Lack of recognition. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." In ancient China, a wise old carpenter named Wei built a bridge that connected two distant villages. Years later, people crossed it daily without a second thought, never knowing his name. When asked if it bothered him, Wei smiled and said, "The river does not thank the rain, yet it flows because of it." True fulfillment does not come from recognition, but from knowing you have made a difference, even if no one sees. The impact of a life well lived is its own reward. I spent my whole life building, not with bricks and mortar, but with sacrifice and love. I worked long hours so my children could have the opportunities I never did. I saved every spare dollar to send them to college. I stayed up late helping with homework, woke up early to make their breakfasts, and swallowed my own struggles so they wouldn't have to carry them. And yet, as the years passed, something strange happened. The phone calls became fewer, the visits became shorter. They had their own lives now, careers, families, responsibilities. I understood that, but still on some nights, when the house was too quiet and the echoes of old laughter faded into memory, I wondered, did they remember? Did they know what I had given? Did they ever stop to think about the things I sacrificed so they could have the life they now enjoyed? One Thanksgiving, my son arrived late, barely glancing up from his phone as he greeted me. I sat at the dinner table, surrounded by family, yet feeling invisible. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell them I am still here. I am more than the past that raised you. I am a person longing to be seen. But I didn't. I simply smiled, passed the dishes, and swallowed my unspoken words along with my dinner. Then something happened. After the meal, my grandson, barely 10 years old, sat beside me. "Grandpa, did you always live here?" he asked. I chuckled. "No, son. I grew up in a tiny apartment, sharing a bed with 2 brothers. We had nothing, but your father, oh, he had dreams. So I worked. I built a life for him, a home, a future." He blinked, wide-eyed. "So you did all that for Dad?" "Yes," I said softly. He nodded, thinking hard, then ran off. I didn't think much of it until later when I overheard him talking to his father. "Dad, Grandpa built everything for you. Do you ever thank him?" My son was silent for a long time before finally saying, "I guess I don't say it enough." And just like that, a seed was planted. Recognition may not always come when we expect it. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it comes from places we least expect. But in the end I realized something. I did not build for praise. I built because I loved. And love in its purest form does not seek applause. Now, tell me, have you ever felt unseen for the things you've done? Have you ever longed for appreciation that never came? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. In the end, the way others see you, whether with admiration, resentment, or indifference, says more about them than it does about you. People may envy your resilience, misunderstand your words, or overlook your sacrifices, but that does not diminish your worth. You are not defined by the opinions of others. You are defined by the life you've lived, the wisdom you've gained, and the love you've given. Not everyone will recognize the effort, the struggle, the quiet strength it takes to grow older with dignity. But that's okay, because recognition is fleeting, while self-respect lasts a lifetime. So I ask you, what truly matters in the end? The approval of those who may never understand your journey, or the peace of knowing you have lived authentically on your own terms? Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt unseen or unappreciated for the life you've built? Have you ever struggled with how others perceive you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a conversation, because your experiences, your wisdom, and your voice deserve to be heard. And if this message resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because wisdom is meant to be shared.